Welcome back. We're talking about the 10-year tragic anniversary of Hurricane Katrina here on Night Talk. Get to the point on the Pittsburgh Cable News Channel. Mario Browne, I want to ask you this question. A lot of people have said that based on the physical health of those, including those in the lower ninth in New Orleans, and some of the other mental and societal issues they have been dealing with for generations, that they were sitting ducks by the time Hurricane Katrina came. Is that a valid statement? And if it is for 2005, are they still sitting ducks if something like that were to transpire, let's say, at the end of this summer?
You know, it's hard for me to imagine calling anyone in a situation like that a sitting duck. I mean, we're talking about human lives, we're talking about human beings. It should not matter, as Jim even talked about earlier, having a plan. The plan is for everybody, the emergency response plan. So no one should be considered a sitting duck, and especially those that may have physical or mental handicaps.
But with that said, aside from the terminology that I used, the fact that they were trapped, they did not have the resources, they may have underestimated the storm and may not have had access to all of the information. Were they in fact basically there and at most risk? Let me clean it up and put it that way for you. Once
again, I will still say though that, Lenny, that we really need to look at the way that the equitable portion of this. Everyone, if we are responsible for our society, and that in the effect that there is some emergency or a natural disaster, there should be no one left behind. There should be no one who, based off their socioeconomic status, based off their race, based off their education, who should get a lesser amount of protection or a less opportunity to survive a catastrophe than anyone else.
True, but that's exactly what we learned, right?
But they were sitting ducks. You know, the Silver engineers knew the levee was waiting for a disaster. Anything you read, it says, yeah, it was a natural disaster, but the human errors contributed to that disaster. They were sitting ducks. They were poor. They had no transportation to get out. They were living in very poverty-stricken areas. They were sitting ducks because they were they were the largest group. The people of color were the largest group, but they were the most disadvantaged group.
Exactly.
It's very different than Jim. Jim's area is to some degree a homogeneous area.
Yeah, but the way I
Katrina
understood
wasn't.
Lenny's question was, is there something inherent about those individuals? And I would submit to you that it's our policies.
It was policies and poverty. You can say when it comes to that, right?
And when it comes to poverty, you still have to look at access. You still have to look at policies.
And you know, let's hypothetically say that it was not a Katrina in New Orleans. Hypothetically, let's say that it was an F5 tornado that tore through one of the more affluent sections of New Orleans. Their preparation was just as inadequate. Unfortunately for all of us, when this tragedy hit, they were poorly prepared across the board, and more unfortunately, some of the most needy in our society suffered the worst.
And I want to ask you a question about that before I go to Dr. Copeland. Let me ask you a question about that, Jim. One of the things that I think is one of the most highlighted aspects of Hurricane Katrina with the leadership there, to criticize former Mayor Nagin, Ray Nagin, was the fact that there were dozens of school buses that were sitting there and unused. And when we come back from break, I want to talk about what happens when leadership fails, the type of wasted resources, wasted opportunities, and lost lives that can come about as a result. We continue to talk about Hurricane Katrina, lessons learned, and we'll move forward from here on Night Talk. Get to the point. Dr. Copeland, when we start looking at Katrina and looking back at what happened, and particularly the wasted resources that were there, and one of the things that hits me the most, we started talking about those that were impoverished, that didn't have the transportation to evacuate, whether it was on time or even at all. Right. You sit there and you see dozens of school buses underwater where people could have escaped and lives could have been saved. You start thinking about that. Doesn't the lack of planning only highlight the disparities between those that have and have not, those that are forgotten about this society, those that are impoverished in this society? And isn't that one of the lessons that if anything else came out, should have been something that was striking to us as Americans?
I totally agree with you. There was a lack of planning. There was an opportunity to be prepared. But even, I think even if they had been prepared, who would have been the ones prepared? To what degree would everybody have had the same information? To what degree would everybody been shoved along to get to wherever they needed to go as quickly as they got there? My concern is that they were not sitting ducks to just be sitting there. It wasn't of their own accord that they were sitting there. But they were sitting ducks in terms of the neglect that the government had for them. And so that's what I mean. They were neglected. It was a group of people who were neglected, they were poor, and there was no plan. And had there been a plan, would they have been included in that plan?
We were talking about a tragedy of errors. And Jim, you brought this up during the commercial break, and it seemed like there was one that played out after another, after another, after another. And I'm going to talk to you about the political aspect of all this and leadership more than political. They were sent into the Superdome. And that led to another comedy of errors, everything from healthcare considerations to safety considerations. We heard about rapes and we heard about violent crime and all type of stuff going on that were perpetrated against very young victims by people that had no regard for law during this period of time. Is there anything that once you get to that point of time with the lack of planning and once you have to do something like send folks to the Superdome, is there anything that a government can do to help people in that situation? Or again, was that just another highlight of, well, you neglected them when it came to the evacuation, you neglected them when it came to how to give them shelter if they couldn't evacuate, and so this was nothing more than a failure of leadership repeatedly?
Lenny, I think, in my analysis of it, and I've looked at it, and I've looked at some of the briefings afterwards, it was a complete breakdown in leadership. It was an absolute fiasco in leadership, and I'm talking from Mayor Nagin to the president and everything in between, some more than others. Paul Browne, the director of FEMA, who took a lot of heat, some of it deserved, some of it not deserved, had done a hypothetical storm scenario for New Orleans literally months before Katrina. They called it Hurricane Pam. Worst case scenario for New Orleans, Mr. Director Browne told the administration, is a Cat 5 coming up. The levees are going to go down, and he pointed out the demographic and those who would suffer as a result of that. The response by the mayor and the governor was inadequate. And literally, when this thing started to, as our guest said, started to blow up in the Gulf, they still had days. And Mr. Browne was urging the president to put the heat on the governor and the mayor to do more than they were doing. And the president was in Crawford. He didn't do it. This is coming from Director Browne. And then the governor had opportunities to do some things she didn't. Mayor Nagin had an opportunity to get those buses down there and do mandatory evac. He didn't do it. And everything else, he told them to go to the Superdome when Browne told him, if those levees go down, the Superdome is going to be surrounded by 8 feet of water. We will not be able to get in there. So it was a complete breakdown at all levels.
So I'm going to ask the non-political people on the panel this before I shift it back to you, because I'm sure you'll have a different answer. So I'm going to ask you first, Mario. When you look at this with Ray Nagin, somebody that was elected mayor of New Orleans in large regard because he was a business executive for a cable company down there, and that was his claim to fame. When you look at how New Orleans politics had been for the longest time, whether it was Republican or Democrat, there was corruption constantly, there was corruption in the police force constantly. It was nothing new, and it was one of the few bipartisan things we found in America was the corruption in New Orleans. When you look at that, do you see what happened with Katrina as a breakdown of politics and civics, or just a breakdown of leadership despite those things?
Yeah, I absolutely have to see it as a breakdown, specifically in leadership, as was said, because leaders are responsible for others. And what I saw was people looking out for themselves and trying to protect what they had versus looking out for the general population. So, to me, it's kind of clear-cut leadership breakdown. No one working as a team. I think some of the analogies you made earlier were, it reminded me of if you're on a football or basketball team, everyone has a role to play. And you will always have those memories of when you dropped the ball.
Good, Jim.
Yeah, study the film, study the film. We had done so many practices with that disaster plan. There were departments in the disaster plan. You had police, you had fire, you had logistics, you had communication, not just to the media, to tell them every day what was going on, but to everybody in the town. Because nature abhors a vacuum to begin with. Now you take everybody that they've just lost everything, and now they're panicking. And now that's going to that need for information is going to accelerate. The more of a gap in communication, the higher the panic, and the more you see some of the things we saw with Katrina: lack of response, lack of answers. We made sure every day they knew what was going on, and even if it wasn't what they wanted to hear, we had an obligation to tell them.
Dr. Copeland.
But I think there was not just leadership where there was a breakdown, because we often want to point to one variable for something happening. We want to say, oh, well, this connects to this. Ray Nagin was as corrupt as everyone else. But what about the police who stood at the bridge and wouldn't let people go across?
Absolutely.
What about the police that was shooting people, you know, on the side just so that there wouldn't be any? I mean, there was so much going on. It was the leadership at the top, as well as the residents who were on the other side of the bridge, who really could have helped,
but let me
refused to help.
Let me ask you this question, Dr. Copeland, because it's very interesting that you would bring up the corruption. Because one of the things that came out, and I mentioned this on my starting point, was the fact that Kanye West made it a point to make it racial. A lot of people saw the images from New Orleans specifically and focused on the race aspect of that, despite the fact that there were plenty of white people in Mississippi that were going through the same exact thing. That wasn't what was focused on. So I want to ask you this. Considering that New Orleans had a black mayor at the time, why did this become a racial situation for many in the United States that got shifted to George W. Bush that may or may not have needed to have been shifted to Bush, considering, like you just said, Nagin, black, police chief and police leaders throughout New Orleans, black, and the fact that we had white Americans in Mississippi going through the same exact thing, perhaps with some of the same exact frustrations, without the racial impetus that we saw in New Orleans.
Well, that sort of implies, because Nagin was African American, that he would have taken care of all the African American problems in New Orleans.
But you would think that racism wouldn't be a problem with an African American mayor, right?
But he was corrupt. It wasn't, I don't think it was about race with Nagin. I think it was about the corruption of power.
Correct.
I think you said it yourself. I mean, his claim to fame was that he had worked for some cable station or something, but he had no leadership at all, because had he had some leadership there when this disaster happened, it would not have taken us that long to figure out his incompetence.
And we all know what ended up happening to him. He ended up going to jail for corruption. When we come back, we're going to ask the question, what have we actually learned and applied since Hurricane Katrina 2005? Coming up next here on PCNC.